Before there were senators and legions, before the marble columns rose above the forum, there were the gods. They did not live in some distant, unreachable realm. According to the Romans, the divine and the mortal shared the same city, the same streets, the same daily rhythms. A Roman citizen could wake before sunrise, murmur a prayer at the small shrine in the corner of his home, and begin his day confident that something, someone, had heard him. This is the story of that world. A world where divine forces governed every river, every hearth, every door hinge. A world where myth was not fairy tale but explanation, a map of invisible forces that shaped human fate. This is the world of Roman gods and myths. Rome did not separate religion from civic life. For a Roman, they were the same thing. The very founding of the city was a sacred act. According to tradition, Romulus, son of the war god Mars and the Vestal virgin Rhea Silvia, traced the outline of Rome's first boundary with a plow. To cross that line uninvited was not merely a legal offense. It was a religious transgression. When his twin brother Remus leapt over the new wall in mockery, the consequence was swift and absolute. The boundary was sacred. Its violation demanded a price. This founding myth encoded a principle that would define Roman civilization for over 1,000 years. The gods do not merely observe human affairs. They participate in them. They invest in them. And they require, in return, something the Romans called the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. The Pax Deorum was not a vague spiritual concept. It was a practical contract. As long as Rome honored the gods with proper ritual, sacrifice, and devotion, the gods would ensure Rome's prosperity, military success, and survival. Break the contract through neglect, impiety, or sacrilege, and disaster followed. Roman historians regularly attributed military defeats, plagues, and famines to moments when the Pax Deorum had been disrupted. After the catastrophic Roman defeat at the Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, where Hannibal's Carthaginian forces ambushed an entire Roman army, the official explanation was not tactical failure alone. Rome had neglected certain religious rites. The gods had withdrawn their protection. The solution was never simply to improve strategy. It was to repair the relationship with the divine. At the summit of Roman religious life stood the Dii Consentes, the 12 great gods who formed the inner council of the divine world. Their gilded statues stood together in the forum, arranged in 6 male-female pairs, representing the governing forces of the universe. At their head was Jupiter, king of the gods, master of lightning, and the divine guarantor of Roman law and power. Every Roman military campaign began with an offering to Jupiter. Every treaty sworn in Rome's name invoked him as witness. The greatest temple on the Capitoline Hill, the political and spiritual heart of Rome, was dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva together, a divine trinity that mirrored Rome's own vision of ordered power. Juno, Jupiter's consort, watched over women, marriage, and the long continuity of Roman family life. She was fiercely protective of Rome and, in myth, fiercely capable of vengeance. It was Juno's enduring rage against the Trojans that drove Aeneas, Rome's legendary ancestor, across years of wandering before he could found the bloodline from which Rome itself would eventually spring. The Trojan War's aftermath, filtered through Roman imagination, became the founding trauma from which an empire was born. Mars occupied a position in Roman religion that his Greek counterpart Ares never held in Athens. In Greece, Ares was feared and distrusted, the chaos of war made divine. In Rome, Mars was a foundational deity, the father of Romulus himself, and a god not merely of violence but of military discipline, martial valor, and the organized force that built civilization. Soldiers offered prayers to Mars before battle not to unleash destruction, but to channel it with purpose. Venus carried extraordinary weight in Roman identity. As the divine ancestor of the Julian family, and therefore of Julius Caesar and the emperors who followed, she linked the mortal and divine in a direct genealogical line. When Virgil composed the Aeneid, Rome's great national epic, it was Venus who interceded on behalf of Aeneas at every critical moment. The goddess of love was simultaneously the mother of Rome's imperial destiny. The remaining Olympians, Neptune, Mercury, Diana, Apollo, Vulcan, Ceres, and Bacchus, governed seas, commerce, hunting, prophecy, fire and craft, agriculture, and the vine, respectively. Together they formed a complete system, a divine administration that mirrored Rome's own bureaucratic thoroughness. Every domain of life had its governing deity. Every deity could be approached, appealed to, and honored. But the great Olympians were only the most visible tier of a far more complex divine world. In every Roman home, a small shrine called a lararium held the household gods, the Lares and Penates. The Lares were ancestral guardian spirits, the protective presences of those who had lived and died in the family before. The Penates governed the household supply of food and resources. Every morning, the head of a Roman household made a small offering at this shrine, a pinch of incense, a portion of food, a spoken prayer. The gods of the home were not distant. They lived in the walls. Beyond the household, the Roman landscape itself was inhabited by divine forces. Every river had its god. Every spring had its nymph. Ancient woodland groves, the Luci, were considered sacred spaces where the boundary between human and divine thinned. To cut trees in such a grove without ritual permission was a serious transgression. Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings, endings, and transitions, held a uniquely Roman character. He had no precise Greek equivalent. His temple in the Roman Forum was of symbolic importance. Its doors stood open during times of war and were ceremonially closed during periods of peace. In Rome's long history, those doors were reportedly closed only a handful of times. Even Terminus, the god of boundary stones, commanded religious respect. When Jupiter's great temple on the Capitoline Hill was constructed, augurs reportedly found that the god Terminus refused to yield his ancient stone marker to make way for Jupiter's foundations. The Romans interpreted this as an omen. The boundaries of Rome would never be moved. They left Terminus's stone in place within the temple floor, cutting a hole in the roof above it so the sky god could see his humble neighbor. Roman mythology was not a random collection of stories. It was a coherent body of narrative designed to explain who Rome was, where it came from, and why it deserved to govern the world. The myth of Aeneas, a Trojan prince who survived the destruction of Troy, carried his aged father on his shoulders through the flames, and sailed westward across years of hardship to found a new people in Italy, encoded core Roman values in narrative form. Pietas, devotion to family, duty, and the gods. Virtus, courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Fatum, the acceptance of a divine destiny larger than personal desire. When Aeneas reached Italy and had to choose between love and mission, abandoning Queen Dido of Carthage, who loved him because the gods demanded he move on, the myth told every Roman what duty required. The myth of Hercules resonated deeply in Roman culture. His 12 labors, undertaken as penance for a tragedy that was not entirely his own fault, represented the Roman belief that suffering, endured with discipline and without self-pity, was the mechanism through which greatness was achieved. Hercules was not simply a hero. He was the divine template for what human effort, properly directed, could accomplish. Even the myth of Prometheus, inherited from Greek tradition but adapted by Roman thinkers, carried philosophical weight. The Titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity was not simply a rebel. He was the patron of human ingenuity, the divine sanction for civilization itself. Roman philosophers and poets found in him a meditation on the relationship between knowledge, suffering, and progress. Roman religion was fundamentally practical. The relationship with the gods was maintained not through private faith alone, but through public ceremony, the careful, correct performance of ritual. The Roman calendar was dense with religious observance. More than 40 official festivals punctuated the year, each tied to specific deities, specific purposes, and specific rituals. The Lupercalia in February, one of Rome's oldest festivals, involved purification rites tied to fertility and the city's pastoral origins. The Saturnalia in December transformed social hierarchies. Masters served their household servants, gifts were exchanged, and the golden age of Saturn, the god of agriculture and abundance, was briefly, ceremonially reenacted. Sacrifice was the central act of Roman religious practice. At public ceremonies, animals, bulls, sheep, and pigs, depending on the deity being honored, were offered with precise ritual care. The state employed specialized priests, the haruspices, who examined the entrails of sacrificial animals to read divine messages. This was not superstition in Roman eyes. It was a diagnostic technology, a means of checking whether the gods had accepted the offering and what they intended for Rome's future. The Vestal virgins, 6 women who served the goddess Vesta, guardian of Rome's sacred hearth flame, represented the connection between religious practice and the survival of the state itself. The hearth fire in Vesta's temple was never permitted to go out. Scholars note that Romans believed an extinguished flame was not merely an inconvenience, it was an existential warning. The fire of Vesta was, in symbolic terms, Rome's life. Rome's divine world did not end with the decline of traditional religion in late antiquity. Its influence persisted in language, calendar, art, architecture, and law. The days of the week bear the names of Roman gods. The planets carry them still. The concepts of divine law, civic duty, and the relationship between the sacred and the political that Rome developed over centuries fed directly into the legal and philosophical traditions that shaped the modern world. When a Roman citizen stood before the Capitoline Temple at dawn, watching the first light catch the gilded roof, and offered a quiet prayer to Jupiter, he was not engaging in mere superstition. He was participating in a vast, living architecture, a civilization's attempt to understand the forces that governed existence and to stand in proper relationship to them. The gods of Rome may no longer receive sacrifices, but the questions they were built to answer about duty, fate, divine order, and what we owe to something larger than ourselves have never stopped being asked. Every civilization builds its gods in its own image. Rome built gods of law, discipline, duty, and ambition, and then asked those gods to confirm that Rome's ambitions were just. Whether one reads this as profound or merely convenient, the Romans themselves never doubted it. They believed the gods had chosen them, and for 6 centuries, the evidence seemed to agree. What you have just experienced was built using AI-generated visuals and narration, technology that allowed us to reconstruct a world that vanished 2,000 years ago. I Am History Rebuilds. If you found value in this journey, subscribe, There is far more of Rome waiting. And leave a comment below. Which Roman god story do you want us to explore next?